It's one of our most sacred responsibilities is the oversight and supervision and leadership of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And too many times in the 3 years that our administration has served the state of North Dakota in the Attorney General's office, we've gathered at times like this to talk about the fruits of the investigation of officer-involved shootings, which have become nothing short of epidemic in the state of North Dakota. This particular matter, which was also thoroughly investigated and handled by the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, occurred on November 13th, 2024, here in Fargo. It was the officer-involved shooting of Mr. Peter Greco, age 65, in the 6100 block of South Fargo, 61st Avenue, here in South Fargo. I'd ask you to pay close attention to some facts I'm going to run through that are not facts from that exact moment that this took place. It's critically important in assessing, making the assessment that the Chief Deputy and I were called upon to make at the conclusion of this, but also for officers on the scene. It's critically important, the information that is known to them when they respond to this scene. And I'll start just with that day, and you're going to hear some stuff about many years prior as well with regard to Mr. Greco in this residence. But on that particular day at 7:30, around 7:30 in the morning, there was a call to Fargo police officers Dosh and Adair. They received a call of an individual, Peter Greco, at a known address in South Fargo, and that he was distressed, and that he was threatening suicide. At some point, Officer Dosh got onto the phone with Peter Greco, and Peter Greco then relayed that he had a plan and he made a threat. He let the officers know that he intended to exit the residence when they arrived and that he would be carrying a firearm. He made clear that he would be carrying that firearm, that he would then point that firearm at law enforcement, leaving them with no option but to shoot him, commonly relayed to as suicide by cop. It is important to note that Mr. Greco was well known to the Fargo Police Department. As far back as 2008, continuing in 2011, continuing in 2013, 2016, 2018, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. Similar calls, similar threats by Mr. Greco. Officers responded in each of these instances to the residence, and many times made entry into the residence, where they observed across the years numerous firearms, numerous knives observed throughout the location. Officer Dosh had been in communication with Sergeant Mock and attempted to de-escalate after that 7:30 a.m. phone call, attempted to de-escalate the situation and relayed to Mr. Greco that because of the plan that Greco had, from what Greco intended to do and the threats he was making, law enforcement was not going to be able to respond to that premises. Greco persisted throughout the morning. He made multiple 911 calls, 6 in total. At about 10:15, he changed his tune a little bit and changed it to now he needed medical assistance. He made the medical assistance call, and the Red River Dispatch began the process of dispatching Fargo Fire and an ambulance service out to the residence. But dispatch also contacted Fargo Police Sergeant Lucas Mock. Lucas Mock had multiple interactions with Mr. Greco across the years, and dispatch called him wisely for guidance in the circumstance. Sergeant Mock was aware of the history, as I said, was aware of the weapons, the knives and the guns that had been seen on that premise. He was also aware that that Mr. Greco had prior military experience in service. Sergeant Mock was also aware of the specifics of the 7:33 a.m. phone call taken by Officer Dosh, where he then Mock had told them, he gave them the advice to not respond for obvious reasons. At 8:15, Sergeant Mock called Mr. Greco to explain to him specifically why law enforcement was not going to be responding, in a further attempt to de-escalate the situation and not leave him frantic and wondering what was going on. Another call came in, and Mock subsequently contacted, and he said that he was going to call Mr. Greco himself again. And he was going to do this in an attempt to make sure that when now under this medical assistant call, that the Fargo Fire Department and the ambulance service would arrive to a situation that was safe. He called Greco, got him on the phone, and he told Mr. Greco that he was going to need to peacefully exit that residence. And he's going to have to do that without a weapon of any kind. Sergeant Mock had spoken with Greco earlier in the morning. He did note a change in Greco's demeanor at this point. He had sounded more sluggish and more slurring earlier in the day, and now that had changed for the better. And there was some improvement in that demeanor. Greco then told Sergeant Mock that, well, if he did commit suicide, he was trying to assure him, he said, if I am going to commit suicide, I'm going to fall on my 14-inch knife, and I don't even have a gun that's close by. Sergeant Mock and Police Officer Abraham Moline volunteered to assist, along with a training officer at the time, Fargo Police Officer Princeton Harris. They responded to the scene. Officer Moline had also had extensive contact over the years and in these other calls with the subject in this instance. And he had also had participated before and helped negotiate the peaceful resolution of incidents with Greco. Sergeant Mock, Officers Harris and Moline arrived at the 6100 block. They positioned their vehicles in a defensive fashion, and Sergeant Mock continued his phone conversation, attempting to further de-escalate the circumstance. Greco, during that phone call, continually assured Sergeant Mock that he was then unarmed. He told him this repeatedly, claiming that he had no knife and claiming that he had no firearm. Understandably, Sergeant Mock was skeptical of that and told Mr. Greco he was going to need to be showing his hands and come out on all fours, basically crawl out of the premises for officer safety. Mr. Greco agreed that he would not be carrying a weapon of any kind. He agreed that he would be crawling out for the officer's protection, and all the officers on scene were aware of that information. But also important during this conversation, Greco attempted to lure the officers into the residence. Because he had called, remember, this last time, saying now it's a medical assist, and he said that he was stuck on the steps, that he was somehow disabled and wasn't able to get out of the premises. They told him that they weren't going to be able to come into the premises. He assured them then that he was going to be able to come out. And I already told you that he gave the assurance he wasn't armed in any way and that he would crawl from the premises. A short time later, however, he did emerge from that residence. He was walking, not proceeding out of the premises as he had been instructed and as he had agreed. He was also, as he emerged from his residence, carrying a firearm. The firearm that's pictured here, blown up a little bit there. We have the firearm with us today. Looking from the side, you can see what appear to be the casings for a .357 Magnum. Anyone familiar with firearms at all, as obviously law enforcement is, would see this to be. I'm carrying it. It's got the weight of, in every way, shape, and form, the appearance of a .357 mag revolver. Mr. Greco was carrying that firearm as he came out. He was carrying it down at his side. I'm going to show you when we get to the conclusion of this, the ring video from a neighboring house. And we put an oval, a well-lit oval around the firearm so you can see Greco carrying it as he emerges from the house, from his house. And we'll be showing you a couple of videos of this incident up to the point where you'll understand why we're not. I'll note the exact time down to the second for I think would be apparent reasons. At 10:51 and 9 seconds, well, just immediately prior to that, a couple seconds earlier, he emerged from the residence. At 10:51 and 9 seconds, he emerged around the corner of his residence and now is visible to the officers on the scene, to Officer Harris and Sergeant Mock. He initially had this gun it was in his right hand, and it was aiming down toward the ground. Officer Mock immediately instructed Mr. Greco to show me your hands. He told him this repeatedly. He told him this in a calm, cool, and measured fashion. He told Greco repeatedly to drop the firearm, drop the gun 7 times. He instructed him to drop the guns. They're between 20 and 30 feet away. Let's say 25 feet, very close in proximity. Sergeant Mock's tone and manner were in all ways calming. They were in all ways clear, direct, not challenging in any way, shape, or form, but clearly directing him to drop the gun, Peter. Greco would not relent and did not comply with the lawful order of the officers. Greco continued to walk and close that distance between himself and Sergeant Mock and Officer Harris. He refused to drop the gun at any point in this incident, and at one point, finally, moments in, at exactly 10:51 and 32 seconds, he raised the gun, directly aiming at Sergeant Mock. Well, in the direction of both Sergeant Mock and Officer Harris, but more directly at Sergeant Mock. Again, now at this point, they're anywhere from 20 to 25 feet. At that moment, under the facts present in this case, not even absent everything else that had been known to law enforcement, and specifically 2 of the law enforcement officers on the scene, but everything that was known to law enforcement, even without that, law enforcement had clearly been placed in imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. As the subject, Mr. Greco, raised that firearm, he got it all the way up to parallel, aimed directly in the direction of Sergeant Mock. Sergeant Mock discharged his department-issued 9mm pistol a total of 4 times. At the same time that volley was taking place, Fargo Police Officer Harris discharged his department-issued 9mm pistol a total of 2 times. And then immediately radioed in, shots fired, shots fired, shots fired. The defendant was struck a total of 4 times by the shots from the officers. He fell to the ground immediately, and within moments, the officers had moved in to start doing what officers who are well trained do next. Fargo Police Department administered and attempted life-preserving care. Officer Moylan, who had been around the garage from where the other 2 officers were out as the subject walked from the residence, he was the first to provide that care. Officer Moylan, to whom Mr. Greco was well known across these years, began the process of providing CPR to the subject. Officer Harris runs to another vehicle to retrieve an AED, which he then brings back. And they start to take the subject out of his clothing so that they can apply the AED in an attempt at life-preserving care. Paramedics who had been staged nearby arrived at the scene, and they continued that care. They were quickly in contact with a medical doctor here in Fargo, relaying what was happening, and at 10:58 and 19 seconds, they were instructed to call it. Peter Greco was deceased. A total of 4 rounds struck Greco 2 projectiles were removed from his body during the autopsy. 1 projectile, possibly 2, were located at the steps in one of the residences. 1 projectile was located somehow by the investigators in the grass between the 2 residences. 1 projectile struck one of the structures at the premises and probably disintegrated there, wasn't located. In this instance, in compendium to all of the facts that were known to the officers that day alone, but also adding to that the hours that leading up to that moment and the years leading up to that, all those facts, all the circumstances, the clear law of the state of North Dakota and the clear policy of the Fargo Police Department lead me to the conclusion that Sergeant Lucas Mock, Police Officer Princeton Harris of the Fargo Police Department, their use of deadly force on that date and in this incident was reasonable in every way, was justified in every way, and was lawful in every way. To which I would add this: it was exemplary. It was exemplary because it showed poise, professionalism, and care, even for a person who was putting Fargo police in serious threat of serious bodily injury or death. It was exemplary. It is a credit. They are a credit to their uniform. They're a credit to the Fargo Police Department. They are a credit to the community that they are sworn to defend and protect. I'm going to ask if we could turn these around. On here, we have the most applicable provisions of North Dakota law and the Fargo Police Department policy. On these matters, they speak for themselves. The facts of this case end up in a situation that can't be more clearly and squarely addressed. It's important for the public. It's important for the public to have those assessments made. And I know that the Chief Deputy joins me in thanking our BCI for doing such a thorough and professional job in a recognition that what they're doing is going to provide the eyes for the community to the work of the police department. We've had too many interactions with the Fargo Police Department in this regard in the last years. They've been too many times been the subject of violence extended their way. And I was saying to the mayor beforehand, and I talked to the chief when we talk regularly, we were talking again this morning, this is a well-trained police department. If I can add some editorial comment, it's a well-staffed police department. You are recruiting wisely, you are training well, and the public is being very well served. In thinking about this, I thought it important to also mention this, which doesn't bear on this particular decision in this case, but is important for us all to keep in mind. That map of North Dakota, the beautiful state of North Dakota, every blue dot on there is an officer-involved shooting in just the last 5 years. Now, I'm a 4th-generation North Dakotan. I grew up in this community. I seem to recall 3 shootings my entire childhood. I look at that map, and this isn't even all shootings. This is 5 years of officer-involved shootings, shootings where officers are forced to use deadly force in response to people conducting themselves in a way that places the officers in reasonable threat of serious bodily injury or death. That is a profound statement. There are gold stars on there too. And no one needs to remind this community of the gold stars. Those are where the officers have given their life in the protection of their communities across the state of North Dakota. We'll be taking your questions here in a moment. Well, before we do that, Chief, I know the Chief's going to address you as well. And I tell the chief these things. I don't say these things just in public to pat people on the back for the fun of it. That's not even who I am. This is life and death work. And I don't work for the police. I'm not their lawyer. I have a public responsibility. But it is a privilege when you see people that didn't just sign up for life and death work, that you got a culture in your department and you got people working at this in a way that is so conscientious. I know how proud you are. And I hope that you all understand that there's a lot of other people that are really proud too of your department and the people in it. Before we get to that, I do want to run these. I'm going to run these videos. We've gone through and talked about it a little bit. The first video that we're going to run is from a Ring. It's from a Ring video off of the neighboring house to this incident. I'm going to let it play. I'll just say, yeah, it speaks for itself.
Peter, show me your hands. Peter, drop the gun. Peter, drop the gun right now. Peter, drop the gun. Peter, drop the gun right now. Drop the gun right now. Peter, drop the gun. Drop.
As you're looking at that video, off to your left is Sergeant Mock. Off to your right is Officer Harris, and then to your right, you can't see him, but he's around the corner from there. Is Officer Moylan, and the three of them are on the scene. And it's interesting to note too, and I was talking to the chief about this. Officer Moylan is standing probably the closest. He's standing the closest. He's had experience with this subject as well, and he drew out, knowing he made a conclusion that the two officers had the ability to protect with deadly force if needed, had their firearms. He took out his taser, which I think shows a remarkable restraint in and of itself. He doesn't know for sure what exactly is going to happen next, but his impulse is he's going to find a way. He's going to try to find a way if he can. Now, he didn't see the firearm. He doesn't see what the subject is walking out with. But he went for his non-lethal, and that's what he had in his hand until the shooting stopped. Then he, of course, or started. He didn't have a choice at that point. But he also instructed his trainee officer, Officer Harris, to get his handcuffs ready. They were doing everything they could throughout this day, and during the most focused part of this incident, everything they possibly could and professionally could to de-escalate and have the result be different. He had instructed Officer Harris to get his handcuffs ready in the event that that's the way that it turned. The next video, I'll have you show that one too. Comment on it briefly. This is from the squad car, obviously.
Peter, drop the gun.
This is Moylan right up here.
Peter, drop the gun right now.
He can't see Peter until
Peter,
here.
drop the gun. Peter, drop the gun right now. Drop the gun right now. Peter, drop the gun.
I'll note just real quick, in case this is a question. The law does not require that police wait until they're looking down the business end of that gun. Those are lawful commands to put away a deadly weapon with a man who's making threats on the phone that day and who's known to law enforcement to be threatening to do exactly what he did. But they did that. They paused and they waited. I don't know that their spouses would advise that. But that's the kind of poise under fire that was exhibited by the Fargo Police Department that day. I am, Chief, if you get out of your way here and you can share some comments as well.
Thank you, sir. Certainly our condolences go out to the family of Peter Greco. This is a very tragic event. This is not the kind of thing that anyone wants to see in terms of outcomes. But as the Attorney General just covered in great detail, our officers, as they are trained to do, did everything possible to de-escalate the situation, resolve it without the use of deadly force. However, again, once they get to the point where there are no other alternatives, as the Attorney General said, just that person walking out with the gun down is a lethal threat to our officers. Action beats reaction every time. And if you did a test, I've got the gun down, I can shoot you before you shoot me every time. So at that juncture, excellent restraint shown by both of those officers. You've got a veteran sergeant of 8 years, and you've got a new officer of 10 months under the tutelage of an experienced training officer who was standing off to the side, just as we're trained, to potentially offer non-lethal when it would be appropriate. He never had the opportunity to do that. But great restraint at that point until at the juncture where he points that gun at them. They really have no other alternative but to use deadly force. And this is a tragedy not only for the family, but for our community and our department and those officers who are essentially the method in which Mr. Greco decided to end his life. And based on the long-standing issues that Mr. Greco had going back to 2008, his mental health issues and other issues, I think also a tragedy and emblematic of the mental health gap that we have, not just here in Fargo, but nationally. But this is a situation not unusual to our department. They are dealing with these things on a daily basis. You don't see this in the calls for service, the amount of time that officers, including Officer Dash, spends on the phone because dispatch called with a call. They don't go there, but they're on the phone for a significant amount of time trying to convince someone, don't hurt yourself, don't hurt anyone else. How can we help you without putting ourselves in a dangerous situation? These are not easy tasks, and they are taxing on the mental health of our personnel. And this is a common problem. We've 3,300 plus calls in 2023, mental health related calls for our department. And there is a gap in the mental health and the ability to hold people who should not be, in a sense, walking around by themselves or aren't taking proper treatment or not getting proper care. This was not helpful to Mr. Greco either. And so his history going back 16 years, his first suicide by cop statement, 2008. So this has been a continual issue. Our officers have successfully resolved a lot of these calls and taken Mr. Greco for mental health holds to the VA for treatment. But at the end of the day, none of these facilities hold them any longer than your tertiary 24 or 48 hours, and they're right back out, and they're still in this particular mental health dilemma or suicidal ideation. So it's a huge issue that I think deserves public attention and some innovative approaches, because what we're doing right now, I don't think is effective, and there's an extensive burden on police, especially officers here in Fargo, that they have to deal with. So while we certainly regret the outcome, I'm proud of the officers and the way that they handle themselves in this situation. Officer Harris, 10 months out, imagine 10 months out, which means he's been on the street a couple of months maybe, and was faced with a deadly force decision. That is a big deal for a new young officer. The professionalism of Sergeant Mock and PTO Moylan in post-shooting, making sure that immediate medical care was provided, helping to kind of guide Officer Harris through a really traumatic incident that I'm sure we never anticipated on that day happening. Really extraordinary work on their part. So I want to thank our friends at the colleagues at the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation for their quick response and investigative efforts. We go to them to investigate these incidents so that we have a thorough investigation, a competent investigation, and transparency for our public. So I really appreciate their efforts and the efforts of the Attorney General's office, who takes these matters up to review to make sure that our officers' actions are lawful and appropriate under the law. So thank you for that. We've also, in the last week, had the opportunity to review our internal for policy violations relative to this incident. So that's very typical in a critical incident, where we also will the separate criminal review of whether or not the use of force is lawful, done by the Attorney General or prosecutor. In the internal piece of whether or not there were any policy violations, done by our professional accountability unit. And that review is complete as of today as well. And we have, there's no violations, there'll be no internal action taken against these officers. What we will do is begin the reintegration process for them. As you can imagine, after a traumatic event, we have a lot of mental health things in place, but we're also constructing a reintegration plan to assimilate them back into regular duty, making sure that they're comfortable with that as well and addressing any issues. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So one, just a quick clarification. Is that 5 or 10 years worth of stickers?
Oh, 10. I apologize.
Okay.
If I-
All right. Chief,
I
this
wasn't
is,
trying to make it seem more dramatic. Forgive me. It's 10 years.
all right. Chief, question for you about, do you know roughly how many times since 2008 you have dealt with Mr. Greco?
We had 53 calls for service there. 23 of those were very significant and related to mental health, suicide ideation, suicide by cop, a couple medical assistants, a couple threats to his neighbors where he attempted to antagonize them to engage. His neighbor was a trooper, and in one instance he wanted to antagonize him to try to get him to cause him harm because of his suicidal ideation. So just long-standing issues.
And then you kind of touched on it here. You said you've done mental health holds with Mr. Greco before. You've spoken to this issue at numerous city commission meetings as well. Why couldn't there be a mental health hold that day?
The day this happened?
Correct, yes.
Well,
Because you had been there previously. Is it because previously that morning?
if Mr. Greco had not pointed the gun at our officers, that's exactly what would have happened. Unfortunately, in this instance, that did play out.
This could be for the AG, but whoever could speak on this. Obviously, we know that there's some mental health issues going on in the situation, but you specifically mentioned sluggish speech, and then we saw how Mr. Greco was dressed when he exited. So is there a toxicology report available? Is there any reason to believe that he may have been inebriated in some capacity?
Thank you for that question. I got it here in my notes. I didn't mention it. So thanks for asking about that. The toxicology report shows that there's a variety of items in his system, and I won't even go through them all. He was on some medications and some other matters, but who knows whether they were all medications. But notably, his BAC, his blood alcohol, was 0.279 at that point in the day. And as you recall, the sergeant had spoken with him at 7 in the morning, and he noted that he was sluggish and sounded along those lines. But yeah, he did have some trouble. I'm informed that he did have some trouble walking anyway, but that seemed somewhat apparent from the video also, that was a part of it. Yeah, thanks for that question. Didn't mean to omit that for sure.
This may be for the chief. You kind of hinted at this a little bit. For those, though, who aren't trained to be officers, you mentioned like non-lethal force was not an option. Is that due to the distance, or could you explain and elaborate on that a
Sure.
little, please?
It's probably hard to see in the video, but Officer Moylan, the way the garage and the angle of that garage, he didn't actually have a visual of Mr. Greco prior to him raising the gun at the officers, and they utilized deadly force. So had he maybe continued to walk with the gun down, it's possible he would have been able to tase him and resolve it. Again, enormous restraint on all of their parts, but the way that the incident played out, he did not have that opportunity.
I wanted to know if you could go into a little bit more detail, Chief, about these reintegration efforts that you were talking about as far as getting these officers the mental health treatment that they need before going back on the street.
Sure. And our standard protocol is the mental health checks and after an incident, and then at periodic prescribed times after the incident, and our wellness program affords our officers the opportunities for even on their own check-ins with mental health professionals. But the reintegration piece is something that we're adding into the platform because we recognize that going through a traumatic event like this, you just can't go right back out and take calls for service. And similarly to our tragedy in 2023, every person has different triggers to those traumatic events. We've got a variety of generations in our department, some who may have military experience, some who never have experienced death or trauma before. And we can't just send them right back out and expect that they're going to perform like they did before. And so reintegration really looks at each on an individual basis, and it's going to be different for the new officer who's still training versus Sergeant Mock in terms of how that goes. But utilizing best practice and our mental health providers who deal with public safety, mental health issues, and then working that schedule, so putting them with someone for a period of time until they're comfortable out on the street, and just reintegrating them through if there are issues, addressing those, getting them appropriate mental health care to address that. And really the goal is to get them back to 100% performance out on the street, and then kind of continue to monitor.
This is for Attorney General Drew Wrigley. Drew, you made this map for a reason. You know, what message are you trying to send with this? I mean, you referred to this as an epidemic.
I'm not going to be able to amplify the message that I think it does send. I think, we get questions once in a while about, what our thoughts are and why this is happening so much. We've seen a lot of an escalation, especially over the last decade, of conduct toward officers. And I've told the story many times. I was Attorney General about 1 week when Chief Agent Casey, and along with Lonnie Gabrowska and a couple of the other chief agents, came by my office for kind of a broader brief than they had given in the initial days. And one of the items they brought to my attention was the number of officer-involved shootings in the state in the explosion of those over the last 10 years was just quite notable, and something we talk about a lot. And I got things we'll talk about on a different day here in the legislative session, other matters. That's not really associated with it, but I think it behooves us to inform the public on these matters and talk about it in a broader context, even beyond this, because it impacts everything in the work that the men and women in uniform do across our state, the work that they do every day, they've been doing across their careers, whether they're newer or they've been around for longer. And I think it's just it bears mentioning in this instance. So we put that together, and I just, like I say, it's its own visual, and it's not even, I'll hear from people once in a while and say, well, there's more people in the state now, so there's going to be more violence. You say, you can just surrender that if you want. We still are another thing. We're still the greatest state and the finest nation on the face of the earth. We can still, we've got the greatest schools, we've got the greatest job opportunities, we've got the greatest natural resources, we've got all this great stuff. Violent crime going up for 10 years isn't so great. And the statistics are bad and getting worse. And treatment of law enforcement. Public loves law enforcement. Bad guys, lots of assaults, lots of resisting arrest, lots of fleeing through the communities, lots of misconduct toward them. It bears mentioning. At the conclusion of this, I'm going to, if it's all right with the chief, we've got this on, got it out straight out of the evidence locker over at BCI. The matter's been cleared and observed. I'm going to ask you to look at it. Now you're going to be nervous because you're going to look and you're going to see that it looks like they're the rounds that are there. You're going to be able to hold it. Looks like every other .357 Magnum I've ever seen. Law enforcement believed it to be a .357 Magnum until they got it kicked away from Mr. Greco initially. They secured it at the scene and then turned it over and realized it says on the side right here, it's a .177 caliber BB and pellet gun. I'll get in trouble with somebody, but I'm going to say it anyway. I can't imagine why someone manufactures a piece of equipment like this. I've owned and own a lot of firearms, handguns, long rifles, pellet rifles. It's inexplicable to me, but there it is. I'd even read the name to you if I knew who manufactured it. I can't understand why, but it's no laughing matter. A lot less realistic guns like this are used every day across this country to rob people, to threaten people, to burglarize homes, to keep law enforcement at bay, and in this incident, precipitated this event in all the full description I gave. I'm glad to have you take a look at that if you'd like, and can assure you of its safety coming out of the BCI crime lab here in evidence locker here in Fargo. Anything else? We appreciate you attending today. I want to thank again the chief, Fargo Police Department, for letting us use this facility. We've had the solemn responsibility of overseeing a lot of these. Claire, we haven't even counted them at this point. It's been a lot in the 3 years that we've been on duty in the Attorney General's office. And we again, people might think, well, you're thanking them because they're your colleagues and employees. We're not thanking them because they're professional, they're diligent, and they're serious about their work. The men and women of the BCI are an asset for all of law enforcement, for all of North Dakota, and I thank them. Case is here today as a chief agent and works out of our Bismarck office. And Director Gabrowska is not able to be here today, but Special Agent Scott Volz, who led this investigation effort is here today. Himself had a similar incident, well, not similar in this, but similar in what took place in the last year as well. And then and the supervisory special agent for down here who was on the scene that day. He doesn't supervise from his desk, I've noticed. That's not the way that it goes. But Kelly Weimer here with us today too. But then also, I think the total was 9. There were 9 or 10 BCI agents who did extensive work on this matter, and feel honored to do it, and put together an objective piece of work so that people can come out and assess it. I very much appreciate your police chief and police leadership, who is all too happy to stand in incidents like this and answer questions, because the public deserves to know that we aren't just checking box saying, oh, that's fine. They were in uniform, right? They must be fine to go. That's not what gets done. A very thorough assessment in light of the very clear law of the state of North Dakota and the training requirements and policy matters for the police department here in Fargo, and that accountable people stand and say, yeah, I'll put my name on the line and say that is solid, professional, and as I said, in this instance, again, exemplary police work on behalf of the people of this community and beyond. With that, you're welcome, as I said, to come on up, and if you want to take closer pictures or if you want to handle the weapon itself, you're welcome to do so. I'll set it up here.